"He looks like your deceased son," said the millionaire's fiancée upon seeing the street boy. Then, on a crisp autumn afternoon in New York City, the golden leaves danced through the air like fragments of forgotten memories. The sun, pale and distant, cast elongated shadows over the narrow streets of Brooklyn. Richard Holloway, a man of polished suits and colder expressions, walked beside his much younger fiancée, Claire Bennett. They had just left a charity gala in Manhattan, a grand event with flutes of champagne and hollow laughter echoing beneath chandeliers. Richard, as always, had appeared composed, delivering his speech about generosity while barely masking the fatigue behind his eyes. Claire clutched his arm tightly as they strolled down a quieter street, hoping to escape the opulence and find something more real, more human. Her heels clicked against the pavement, the rhythm of someone used to luxury but yearning for something different. Then she stopped. A few feet away, huddled near a graffiti-covered wall and surrounded by the detritus of the city, sat a boy no older than 12. His clothes hung off his thin frame like rags off a scarecrow. Dirt streaked his cheeks, and his dark, matted hair fell into eyes too weary for a child. He wasn't begging. He wasn't moving. He was simply watching. Claire's breath caught in her throat. She stared, wide-eyed, at the boy as though struck by something unseen. Her voice, almost a whisper, barely reached Richard's ears. "He looks like your deceased son," she said, not as a statement, but as a quiet tremor of disbelief. Richard froze. His spine stiffened. For a moment, the world around them seemed to fall silent, only the distant rumble of traffic remained, like the city itself holding its breath. He did not look at the boy. Instead, he glanced at Claire, his jaw tightening. "That's impossible," he said, his voice flat. "Ethan is gone." Claire's eyes remained fixed on the boy. "But look at him," she urged. "His face, his eyes. There's something." "It's a coincidence," Richard cut her off. "Nothing more." But the chill in his voice was not just from the weather. He reached for her hand and gently tried to pull her away. "Let's go." Claire hesitated, torn between following him and staying. The boy hadn't moved. His gaze, though, was unwavering, locked onto her, not with hope or fear, but a strange, unsettling calm. As they turned the corner, Claire looked back. The boy had lowered his head, curling tighter into himself. Something inside her twisted painfully. She had never seen Ethan in person. He had died before she met Richard. But she had seen photos, framed memories lining the hallway of Richard's penthouse. She had heard the stories, few as they were, of a quiet boy who loved to whistle under his breath and who had once, in a brief moment of joy, carved his name into the old oak desk in Richard's study. Now, she could not shake the feeling that she had just walked past a ghost. That night, back in the echoing silence of their apartment overlooking Central Park, Claire lay awake. Richard, exhausted from the evening, had already drifted into a restless sleep. She stared at the ceiling, her mind replaying the image of the boy again and again. The hollowed cheeks. The faint scar beneath his chin. The eyes, those eyes. She slipped out of bed and padded barefoot into the living room. From a drawer beneath the coffee table, she pulled out the photo album she had once asked Richard to let her see. It had been collecting dust, tucked away as though the memories were too heavy to bear. She turned the pages slowly until she found it, a photo of Ethan, maybe 6 or 7 years old, holding a red balloon in a park. His face was soft, but his expression solemn. His eyes, distant. Just like the boy on the street. Claire closed the album, her heart pounding. She told herself it was grief playing tricks. That her mind was simply connecting the dots between loss and coincidence. But deep inside, a seed had been planted. One that whispered, "What if?" She returned to bed and lay beside Richard, who turned away from her in his sleep. She watched him for a moment, studying his face in the dim light. The man who had buried his son. The man who never spoke of that day. The man who had chosen her, perhaps, to fill a void. The next morning, the city stirred awake in its usual blur of honking horns and hurried footsteps. Claire sipped her coffee in silence, her thoughts elsewhere. Richard read the paper, his expression unreadable. When he glanced at her, she smiled, faintly. But inside, something had shifted. Because somewhere in Brooklyn, a boy with familiar eyes was waiting. And Claire wasn't ready to let him disappear again. Claire returned to the same corner in Brooklyn 3 days later. Wrapped in a beige coat that did little to shield her from the biting wind, she stood near the wall where she had first seen the boy. Her eyes scanned the sidewalk, the storefronts, the piles of forgotten trash swept into corners by the autumn breeze. But he wasn't there. She stayed for an hour, pretending to browse a nearby used bookstore, then walking up and down the block with a paper coffee cup in hand. A man sweeping the stoop of a convenience store gave her a curious glance. "You lookin' for someone?" he asked. Claire hesitated, unsure how much to say. There was a boy here. About 12, maybe younger. He was sitting right there. The man shrugged. Could be any number of Lotta kids come through, don't stay long. Cops chase off, or worse. Sorry. She thanked him and walked away, her stomach tight with frustration. It was irrational, she knew. She had no name, no photo, no real reason to think she would find him again. But the sense of urgency gnawed at her. She couldn't explain it, not to herself, not to Richard, certainly not to anyone else. She only knew she needed to see him again. 2 days later, she returned. This time, she brought a small bag with sandwiches, bottled water, and a fleece blanket. She paced for nearly an hour, about to give up, when she spotted him. He was emerging from the alley behind a closed laundromat, shoulders hunched against the cold, a battered hoodie pulled tight over his head. He moved with the wary steps of someone used to avoiding attention, but his eyes still darted up, meeting hers. Claire didn't move. She didn't speak. She simply waited. The boy stopped, his eyes narrowing. "I brought food," she said gently. "And a blanket. You don't have to come close." He didn't. Claire placed the bag on the ground and stepped back. "You don't owe me anything. I just thought maybe you were hungry." The boy watched her for a long moment, then crept forward. He picked up the bag and backed away again before opening it. He pulled out a sandwich, inspected it, and then took a bite. His hands were trembling. He didn't speak. Claire sat down on the curb, a short distance away. She didn't want to scare him. "What's your name?" The boy said nothing. "It's okay," she said. "You don't have to tell me. I'm Claire." He finished the sandwich before mumbling, "Mason." She smiled. "That's a strong name." He didn't respond. They sat in silence for a few minutes, the kind that stretched between strangers still unsure of one another. Then Mason shifted slightly, the first sign of trust. "You live around here?" she asked. He shook his head. "Nowhere." "Do you have anyone?" she continued. "Family, friends?" He shrugged. "Used to. Not anymore." Claire's heart ached. She wanted to ask more, where he came from, how he ended up here, but she knew pushing too soon would only make him run. "Would you mind if I came by again?" she asked softly. He glanced at her. "Why?" Claire hesitated. "Because. I think you shouldn't be out here. It's getting colder." He looked away. "I've been through worse. Still. Maybe I could help." He didn't say yes. But he didn't say no. Over the next week, she returned every afternoon, always with food, sometimes with small essentials, socks, a winter hat, a thermos of hot chocolate. Mason never said much, but he began to trust her presence. He accepted the gifts without hesitation and even offered occasional pieces of his story. "I lived with a woman. She said she was my aunt," he muttered one afternoon, his voice barely audible over the sound of a passing subway train. "She took care of me. Until she didn't." "What happened?" He shrugged again. "She just left." One day she was there. Next day, she wasn't. How old were you? 7, maybe. And before that? He didn't answer. Claire didn't push. But that night, as she drove back to Manhattan, her mind raced with questions. Why would someone abandon a child so young? Why couldn't he remember anything before that? And what was the deal with the name Elliot he had mumbled under his breath once, as though it meant something but not enough to explain? She didn't tell Richard what she had been doing. He had grown distant over the past week, immersing himself in meetings, charity boards, and silent brooding over the newspapers each morning. When she brought up the boy again, casually, his reaction was immediate. "Claire, enough. Let it go." She met his gaze. "I can't." "Why not?" "Because something doesn't add up, Richard. I'm not saying he is Ethan, but he's not. You don't know that." Richard stood, pacing the length of the room. "Yes, I do. Ethan is dead. That's not something I could ever forget." Claire folded her arms. "Then why are you afraid?" He stopped. "Afraid? You haven't asked a single thing about him. About Mason. Not once. You haven't even asked what he looks like. That's not grief, Richard. That's fear." His face went hard. "You don't know what you're talking about." Claire walked past him without another word. The next morning, she returned to Brooklyn earlier than usual, only to find Mason shivering beside a closed bakery. He looked worse, more tired, thinner, the color drained from his face. "What happened?" she asked, crouching beside him. He didn't look up. "Cops chased me out last night. Lost my blanket. Had to sleep behind a dumpster." Claire bit back her anger. "You can't stay out here anymore." "I always do." "Not this time." Mason finally looked at her, eyes hollow. "Why do you care?" Claire's voice cracked. "Because I can't stop." After a long pause, Mason asked, "Where would I go?" "There's a shelter. A safe one. 4 kids. I checked it out myself." He didn't answer, but when she held out her hand, he didn't refuse it. They walked together, her in her tailored coat, him in tattered layers, down the street toward a shelter nestled between 2 aging brownstones. She had already spoken with the director, a woman named Ms. Adler, who had agreed to hold a bed if the boy agreed to come. Mason didn't say much as he was led inside, but when Claire turned to leave, he followed her with his eyes. "I'll be back tomorrow," she promised. He gave the slightest nod. As she walked away, her phone buzzed. A message from Richard, "We need to talk. Tonight." Claire stared at the screen for a moment, then slipped the phone into her pocket. She had a feeling this conversation would change everything. Claire arrived home later that evening, the city lights glittering below the windows of the penthouse apartment like a sea of restless stars. The warmth inside was starkly different from the chill she had left behind in Brooklyn, but it did little to soothe her unease. She had dropped Mason off at the shelter just hours earlier, and though he was now safe, her mind buzzed with lingering images of the boy's expression, haunted and tired beyond his years. Richard was waiting for her, standing by the fireplace with a drink in hand. He hadn't turned on the lights, so the room glowed only with the amber flicker of flames. Claire hesitated at the threshold, uncertain whether to speak first. He broke the silence. "You've been spending a lot of time in Brooklyn," he said without looking at her. Claire set down her purse. "I told you, I've been trying to help someone." He turned slowly, eyes narrow. "The boy?" "Yes." He let out a long, controlled breath. "You're not a social worker, Claire. You don't know what you're getting into. I know enough to recognize when someone is being ignored by the world. And I know when someone is lying to themselves." Richard's grip on the glass tightened. "You're projecting." "Am I?" she asked, stepping closer. "Because every time I bring him up, you shut down. You won't even say Ethan's name anymore." He looked away. Claire didn't stop. You told me he died in a hospital. That it was sudden. But I've been doing some reading, Richard. Looking into the records. His gaze snapped back to her. You what? I looked into the hospital you mentioned. Elliot Children's. I called. There's no death certificate for Ethan Holloway listed in their records. No record of discharge either. Just a mention of a boy admitted under a restricted file. No name. No follow-up. That doesn't make sense. Richard's face paled. He set down the glass, as if afraid his shaking hands might betray him. You have no right to dig through that. Claire stepped forward. Then tell me the truth. I told you, he died. No, Richard. You told me he died in that hospital. But now I think you told me a story to make it go away. His voice, when it came, was colder than the wind outside. You don't know what that time was like. Then help me understand. But he said nothing. Claire, her voice softening, added, this boy, Mason, he's not just similar. It's in the way he moves. A scar under his chin. A nervous twitch in his hand. Little things. Too many to ignore. You might think I'm chasing ghosts, but I'm not. I know what I saw. Richard turned back to the fire, his silhouette sharp and immovable. Claire took a step back, defeated. If you won't tell me, I'll find out myself. She left the room without another word. The next morning, she returned to the shelter. Mason was awake early, sitting at the edge of his cot with a paperback book resting on his knees. When he saw her, he gave a small nod, but his expression remained distant. You slept okay? She asked. He shrugged. Better than outside. Claire sat in the chair beside him. Do you remember the name of the hospital where you were once taken? He frowned. I think. Elliot. But I don't know for sure. Do you remember what happened after that? He was quiet for a while. A lady came to get me. Said she was family. But she wasn't. Took me somewhere else. Somewhere with other kids. I didn't like it. Claire's hands clenched in her lap. Do you remember your name before Mason? He shook his head. They always called me Mason. You didn't have a different name when you were really little? No one ever said. Claire's heart sank. She didn't want to push further, not yet. Instead, she pulled a small photo from her purse. It was a copy of one from Richard's old album, Ethan standing beside a swing set, no more than 5 years old, a faint smile on his lips. She showed it to Mason. Do you recognize him? He stared at the image for several seconds. Then he shook his head, slowly. No. But the place looks familiar. Claire studied him closely. He wasn't lying, at least, not consciously. But she could see the uncertainty in his face. A memory too faint to reach, but not completely gone. Later that day, she visited Emma, the housekeeper who had been with the Holloway family for over 30 years. Emma lived in a modest home in Queens now, retired but still close to the family in her way. Claire brought her a small bouquet and asked if they could talk. Over tea, Claire got to the point. Emma, I need to ask you something about Ethan. Emma's face tightened with pain. It's been years, dear. I know. But I'm starting to think something's not right. Richard told me he died in a hospital. But there's no record. And now I've met a boy who looks just like him. Acts like him. Emma, is it possible Ethan didn't die? The old woman's hands trembled slightly as she set down her cup. That's not something I can say. Please, Claire urged. I'm trying to help this child. I just need to know if Richard lied. Emma looked away for a long time, her eyes clouded. Finally, she whispered, there were things he never got over. Things he never talked about. Like what? The boy was born from a scandal, Emma said softly. Richard had an affair. The woman died not long after the birth. He tried to raise the boy quietly, privately. But it was always complicated. When Ethan got sick. I don't know what happened after that. I only know one day, he was gone. And Richard never spoke of him again. Claire felt a chill creep through her. So you don't know if he died? Emma shook her head. Only what I was told. Did you ever see any paperwork? A death certificate? No. Claire sat back in her chair, her mind spinning. She left Emma's house more certain than ever that something had been covered up. That night, she stood in front of Richard's study, holding the photo of Ethan and the notes she had taken. The door was locked, as always. But she had seen him enter the code once. She tried it. The door clicked open. Inside, the room was dark and untouched. His old desk stood like a monument to another life. She searched through drawers until she found a leather-bound journal. Inside were pages of writing, angry, desperate, grieving entries that painted a different Richard. One in agony. One who had made a decision he could never undo. The last entry was a single line. He didn't die. I let him go. Claire stared at the words until they blurred. Then she picked up the phone and made a call. Ms. Adler? It's Claire Bennett. Please keep Mason inside tonight. No visitors. No exceptions. Something was happening, and she was finally starting to understand how deep it went. The following day, Claire arrived early at the shelter, her thoughts consumed with the cryptic line she had read in Richard's journal. The sentence repeated itself in her mind like a ticking clock. He didn't die. I let him go. What did that mean? Where had Ethan gone, and why had Richard never said a word? More importantly, how had that decision led to Mason? Ms. Adler greeted her at the front desk, offering a weary smile. He's up. Had breakfast. Quiet, but alert. Claire nodded. Thanks. I won't keep him long. She found Mason in the common area, sitting by the window with his knees pulled up to his chest. The morning sun slanted through the blinds, warming the edge of the carpet near his feet. Claire took the chair beside him. I need to ask you some things, she said gently. Mason didn't look at her. Okay. You told me once you lived with a woman who said she was your aunt. Yeah. Do you remember anything about her? A name? What she looked like? He frowned. She had dark hair. Always tied back. Smelled like smoke. She used to wear this red jacket with holes in the sleeves. I think her name was Lorna. Or maybe Lori. Claire noted it. Do you remember where you lived? An apartment. Small. No windows in my room. She used to leave me alone a lot. Do you remember when you first got there? How old were you? He shifted in the chair. Maybe 6. Or 7. I don't know. It's all blurry. Do you remember anyone before her? A long silence. Then, finally, he whispered, a woman who sang. Claire leaned forward. Sang? She had a soft voice. She used to sing to me at night. Something about stars. I remember lying on her lap once. She was crying. Do you remember her name? Mason shook his head. She called me her little fox. That's all I remember. Claire swallowed. It wasn't much, but it was something. A name like Little Fox wasn't common. A detail like that might help. She opened her purse and pulled out a map of the city. Look. Can you point to where you lived with this aunt? Mason stared at the map, uncertain. Then his finger slowly moved. Here. Near the river. There was a bridge. And a yellow store downstairs that sold candy and cigarettes. Claire circled the area. She would go there later. They sat in silence for a while, and then Mason turned to her. Why are you helping me? He asked. Claire met his eyes. Because I think you're not who you've been told you are. He blinked. What does that mean? It means someone might have changed your life a long time ago. Without asking you. He didn't respond, but she could see the question building in his mind. That afternoon, Claire drove to the neighborhood Mason had pointed to, a neglected part of the Lower East Side. The streets were narrower here, the buildings older, some boarded up. She parked near a corner store with a faded yellow sign and peeling paint. The smell of grease and stale smoke clung to the air. Claire stepped inside. A man in his 50s stood behind the counter, counting bills. "Excuse me," she began, "I'm looking for someone who used to live in this building." A woman named Lorna or Lori. Dark hair, red jacket, maybe had a boy with her. The man glanced up, suspicious. "That was years ago." "Why?" "I'm trying to find out what happened to the boy." The man's expression softened slightly. "I remember her. Lived upstairs. Real quiet. Kept to herself. The kid was always sick. Skinny thing. Never talked much." "What happened to her?" "She disappeared. Cops came once, asking questions. I think they were looking for her. Place was empty after that. Just dust and junk." "Do you know if she was his real aunt?" He snorted. "Didn't seem like it. Never heard her talk about family. More like she was hiding." Claire thanked him and left. The pieces were adding up. A woman with no ties, hiding in a forgotten corner of the city, living with a boy too young to understand where he came from. If Mason was Ethan, then Lorna or Lori had taken him, but why? She returned home late that night, her coat soaked with the drizzle that had begun to fall. Richard wasn't home, and part of her was relieved. She didn't have the energy to confront him again, not yet. Instead, she sat at the kitchen island and opened her laptop. She began searching missing persons cases, narrowed to the years around Ethan's supposed death. She tried every variation: child taken from hospital, boy disappeared from facility, adoption fraud, anything that could tie back to Elliott Children's Hospital. It wasn't until nearly midnight that she found something buried in a legal forum, an anonymous post from years ago referencing a Jane Doe who claimed to have removed a child from a hospital under false identity. The post mentioned she was acting on behalf of the real father, though it was never proven. No follow-up, no legal action recorded. Claire's fingers hovered over the keyboard. Was this woman Lorna? Was Richard involved? She returned to the shelter the next day and brought the article with her. Mason read it slowly, his brow furrowed. "This sounds like her," he said at last. "Do you think she was trying to protect you?" "I don't know," he replied. "She was kind, at first. Then she got scared all the time. Kept saying we had to move. One night, she told me I couldn't call her aunt anymore." Claire looked at him closely. "Did she ever say anything about your real parents?" "No," Mason said. "Just that I wasn't supposed to ask." Claire sat back, her thoughts racing. The boy in front of her had been hidden, perhaps intentionally. And Richard's journal confirmed at least part of the truth: Ethan hadn't died. Now, she needed someone who had been there. She returned home and called a number she had found through the hospital's retired employee registry, a nurse named Harriet Lane who had worked at Elliott Children's during the time Ethan would have been admitted. The woman answered, her voice creaky with age. "I know it's late," Claire said, "but I'm hoping you can help me. I'm trying to understand what happened to a child who may have been in your care." The line was silent for a moment. Then the woman replied, "You're not the first one to ask about him." Claire froze. "What do you mean?" "There was a boy. Came in under a private case. No name. No ID. We were told not to talk about it. A man used to come at night, check on him. Never signed in. Then, one night, the boy was gone. They told us the family took him. But I always wondered. Do you remember the man? Tall. Wealthy looking. Wore gloves. Didn't speak much." Claire closed her eyes. "It was Richard. Did the child have a name?" "We weren't told. just that he had to be kept quiet. His room didn't even have a chart outside. Do you remember what he looked like? A pause. He had sad eyes. Like he was older than he should have been. Claire thanked her and hung up. It was becoming undeniable. Mason wasn't just a boy who looked like Ethan. He was Ethan. And now she had to decide what to do with the truth. It had been 3 nights since Claire's call with the retired nurse. 3 nights of fragmented sleep, her thoughts haunted by the image of a frightened child being whisked away from a hospital under the cover of night, then raised in secrecy by a stranger who vanished just as suddenly. Every fact she uncovered was a thread unraveling the life Richard had so carefully constructed, and every thread led her further into the unknown. She knew she couldn't go back to Richard with theories. Not this time. She needed something undeniable. She began in the one place she hadn't fully explored, the old study in the Holloway estate outside the city. The manor had belonged to Richard's parents and had remained untouched for years, its heavy curtains drawn and halls steeped in silence. Claire had only visited it once, early in their relationship, when Richard insisted on checking the grounds after a storm. He had refused to go inside. That morning, she drove alone through the winding roads of upstate New York until the wrought iron gates appeared. The security system was still functional, and she entered using the same code Richard had once used to open the apartment safe. A long gravel path led to the house, ivy crawling up its stone walls like veins. Inside, the air was thick with dust and time. Claire moved through the room slowly, passing faded portraits and shuttered windows. The study was at the far end of the corridor, a room with dark walnut shelves and a large mahogany desk that hadn't been used in over a decade. She pulled on gloves and began to search. Most drawers were empty or held old receipts and notebooks. Then, in the bottom drawer of a locked cabinet, pried open with a screwdriver she had brought from the car, she found it. A bundle of documents, yellowed at the edges and tied with a string. She laid them out on the desk. The topmost paper was a hospital admission form from Elliott Children's, dated nearly 12 years ago. The name field had been left blank, but the medical ID number matched the one she had recorded from the nurse's story. The diagnosis was vague, something about malnutrition and respiratory issues. Standard enough for a child brought in from uncertain circumstances. Below it was a letter. It was addressed to Richard, signed by a woman named Lorraine Carter. The letter was handwritten, the script sharp and slightly shaky. Mr. Holloway. Per your instructions, the boy was retrieved from the facility and placed in a private residence under my care. There were no issues. No signatures. No legal trail. He has been instructed not to speak of his prior name. The documents you requested will follow separately. I trust this concludes our arrangement. Claire's heart pounded. She read the letter 3 times before moving to the envelope attached beneath it. Inside was a death certificate. It bore the name Ethan Holloway, age 6. Cause of death, respiratory failure due to pneumonia. Date of death, January 12th. But the ink on the date had been tampered with. A closer look showed a different number beneath it, possibly January 6th. Someone had altered the record. The signature of the physician had been forged. And the certificate bore the faint imprint of a watermark, not valid without official seal. It had never been filed. Claire placed everything carefully into her bag, her mind a storm of conflicting emotions. She had proof now, of deceit, of manipulation, of a child's identity erased and replaced. The implications were staggering. Back in the car, she didn't drive away immediately. Instead, she sat staring at the steering wheel, asking herself the question that had been growing louder with each new discovery: why? Why would Richard go to such lengths? She returned to the city and headed straight to the shelter. Mason was outside, sitting on the stoop with a deck of worn playing cards in his lap. He looked up as she approached, eyes cautious but no longer cold. "I need to talk to you," she said. Privately. They sat in one of the smaller rooms used for counseling sessions. Claire pulled the documents from her bag and placed them on the table in front of him. "I think someone tried to make you disappear," she began. "And I think they succeeded for a long time. Mason picked up the photo of the death certificate and stared at it, confused. "That's supposed to be you," she said. "But it isn't." He looked up sharply. "I don't understand." Claire laid out the rest, starting with the hospital form, then the letter from Lorraine Carter, and finally the altar document. "You were taken from a hospital under a false identity. They made it look like you died. But you didn't. You were given to someone else. Hidden. Told a different story." Mason's eyes filled with uncertainty, then fear. "Who would do that?" She hesitated. "Your father." He blinked. "I don't have a father." Claire's voice softened. "His name is Richard Holloway. He's the man I'm engaged to." Mason's face went blank. He stood abruptly, pacing the room. "No," he said. "No. This isn't real. I didn't believe it either, at first. But I've seen the proof. The woman who took you, Lorna or Lori, she was working for him. There's even a journal entry. He didn't think he could raise you. He thought giving you away would protect you. Or protect himself." Mason stopped, staring at the wall. "I remember a man," he said slowly. "When I was really little. He wore a suit. He smelled like cologne. He never talked to me. But I remember him standing in the doorway. Watching." Claire's breath caught. "That was him." Mason turned. "Why would he do that? Why wouldn't he want me?" She couldn't answer. Instead, she handed him the last document, a copy of the photo of Ethan, the one Claire had shown him before. Mason studied it again. This time, his hands didn't tremble. "I feel like I know him," he whispered. "But that's me." "Yes." He sat down, overwhelmed. Claire sat beside him, not touching, just present. "You don't have to decide what to do right now," she said. "But you deserve to know where you came from. You deserve a choice." Mason didn't speak for a long time. Then, finally, he asked, "What happens next?" Claire didn't have an answer. Not yet. But she knew where to start. "Now," she said, "we talk to the one person who's been running from this for over a decade." She reached for her phone and dialed. Richard answered on the second ring. "Claire?" Her voice was calm. "We need to talk. All of us." The meeting was set for that same evening. Claire didn't give Richard a choice. Her voice on the phone had been steady, deliberate. She told him the address of the shelter, not asking if he'd come but informing him that he would. There had been a silence on the other end before he muttered a reluctant, "Fine." She didn't wait for more. Back at the shelter, Mason sat in one of the staff offices, the door closed and a paper cup of lukewarm tea in front of him. He hadn't said much since Claire had shown him the documents. The weight of the truth sat visibly on his small frame, his shoulders tense and drawn inward like a child trying to make himself disappear. Claire stayed close but gave him space, waiting by the window as the late afternoon light filtered through the blinds, washing the room in faded gold. When the sound of a car door shutting echoed from the street, Claire looked out. Richard's black sedan had pulled up to the curb, polished and sterile, out of place against the worn bricks of the shelter's exterior. He emerged in a tailored coat, his expression unreadable, and made his way to the door with slow, deliberate steps. Claire opened the door before he could knock. "This way," she said. She led him through the hallway without small talk. Richard took in the surroundings with barely concealed disdain, the peeling paint, the stained floors, the quiet sounds of children playing in the background. It was clear he didn't belong here, not just in wealth but in spirit. When they reached the office, Claire stopped outside the door. "He's inside," she said. "Before you see him, I want you to understand something." Richard looked at her, his face hard. "You lied," she continued. "Not just to me. To everyone. You let the world believe your son was dead. And now he's in there, alive, confused, and you are going to look him in the eye." Richard didn't respond. Claire opened the door and stepped aside. Inside, Mason stood as soon as he saw the stranger enter. His instinct was defensive, cautious, eyes narrowed. He didn't speak. Neither did Richard. For a moment, the two stared at each other across the room, two versions of the same story, separated by years and silence. The resemblance was undeniable. In the boy's posture, the curve of his jaw, the shape of his eyes. Richard seemed to recognize it immediately, and it hit him like a punch to the chest. "Mason," Claire said gently. "This is Richard." Richard finally spoke. His voice was rough, not quite steady. "You look older than 6. Mason blinked. "I'm 12. Richard gave a stiff nod. The room remained still. Claire moved to the side and sat, letting the moment unfold. Mason's voice broke the silence. "Why?" Richard turned toward him. "Why what? Why did you let them take me? Why did you let me grow up thinking I didn't matter?" Richard ran a hand over his mouth, then slowly sank into the chair across from him. "Because I was a coward." Mason tilted his head slightly, unsure if he believed it. Richard stared at the floor. "Your mother died when you were very young. I didn't know how to raise a child, let alone one born from a relationship I wasn't supposed to have. You weren't part of the life I'd built. You were a secret. And when you got sick, I panicked." He paused, the weight of his confession thickening the air. "I paid someone to remove you from the hospital. To disappear with you. I thought it would be cleaner than trying to explain you to the world. I convinced myself it was for your own good. That you'd be adopted by a better family. But I never followed up. I didn't want to know." Mason stared at him, his hands clenched. "You left me," he said. "With a stranger. I didn't even know my name." "I know," Richard replied, his voice cracking. "I know what I did." Claire watched as Richard's face slowly collapsed, not into tears, but into something worse. Shame. Real, unfiltered shame. "I told myself you had died," he continued. "Because it was easier than facing the truth. I even had a death certificate forged. Told everyone you passed quietly in a hospital bed. And I buried that story so deep, I started to believe it." Mason looked down at the table. "I thought maybe I wasn't real." "You were," Richard said. "You are. And I have no excuse." The silence stretched. Claire remained quiet, letting Mason process the moment. She could see him teetering between emotions, rage, confusion, heartbreak. Finally, Mason asked, "Why now?" "Because Claire found you," Richard replied. "Because I couldn't keep lying when she put the truth in front of me." Mason turned to Claire. "Did you know? The whole time?" "No," she said. "But once I saw you, something didn't feel right. I couldn't ignore it. I had to find out." Mason nodded slowly, then looked back at Richard. "You didn't even look for me." "No," Richard admitted. "And I will never forgive myself for that." Mason stood abruptly. "I don't know what you want from me now." "Nothing," Richard said, also standing. "I don't deserve anything. I came because I needed you to know the truth. Not the version I told the world. The real one. You don't have to forgive me. You don't have to speak to me again. But you deserve to know who you are." Mason's face was unreadable. He opened the door and walked out without another word. Richard turned to Claire, his expression hollow. "I told you this would end badly," he said. Claire stood too. "You made sure it would." "I don't expect him to ever forgive me." "You shouldn't," she replied. He lingered for a moment, then started toward the exit. Claire followed him outside, stopping just before he reached his car. "You don't get to walk away again, Richard." He turned slowly. "You're going to help fix this," she continued. "Not for you. For him." Richard nodded. "What do you want me to do?" Claire didn't hesitate. "Start by funding the shelter. Quietly. Anonymously. Then get a lawyer. Mason's going to need one if we want to set the record straight, his name, his past, everything. And you're going to do all of it without expecting a thank you. Richard looked at her, a flicker of gratitude in his tired eyes. I will. Claire watched as he got into the car and drove off, the engine disappearing into the hum of the city. Back inside, Mason sat on the same chair, arms crossed, his jaw tight. I don't trust him, he said without looking at her. You don't have to, Claire replied. But you should know he's not going to run this time. I won't let him. Mason nodded slowly, then looked out the window, his reflection barely visible in the glass. I don't know what to feel, he said. You don't have to decide that today, Claire said softly. But you're not alone anymore. That much, I can promise. The morning after the confrontation at the shelter, Claire sat in her apartment, staring at the stack of documents she had removed from the study in the Holloway estate. She had scanned and copied every page, secured them in both physical and digital formats, and labeled each with meticulous detail. Every word of Lorraine Carter's letter, every discrepancy in the forged death certificate, every timestamp from the hospital, she had preserved it all. It wasn't about revenge. It was about proof. Mason needed more than apologies. He needed a legal identity. A history. Something solid to stand on. The system wouldn't accept hearsay or moral outrage. And so Claire had begun the next necessary step, building a case, not in court yet, but in reality. She had spent most of the night researching lawyers with experience in child welfare and identity reconstruction. One name kept appearing in forums and interviews, David Reamer. Former federal prosecutor turned advocate for wrongfully displaced minors. She called his office at 8 o'clock sharp. By noon, she was in his office in downtown Manhattan, seated across from a tall man with silver-streaked hair and sharp, measured eyes. Ms. Bennett, he said after reviewing the preliminary documents. I'll be honest with you. This is not a typical identity case. We're not talking about a lost birth certificate or a custody battle. You're talking about erasure. Deliberate removal. Fraud. Claire nodded. I know. You're also talking about a powerful man, with reach and resources. If we move forward, we will be exposing one of the wealthiest names in New York to potential criminal liability. He deserves it, she said. But this isn't about destroying him. It's about restoring Mason. Reamer studied her for a long moment. Do you have access to the child's DNA? Claire reached into her bag and pulled out a sealed envelope. Inside was a used toothbrush Mason had left behind in the shelter the week before, carefully preserved. We can match it to Richard Holloway's. I already have a sample from his comb. I can get the test started today. Reamer nodded. We'll also need hospital records, original identification materials, school documents, anything from the early years. The more we can tie Mason to Ethan Holloway, the stronger we make the case. I'm already working on it, Claire said. But I need help accessing the adoption records. Those are sealed. I know. But the woman who facilitated it, Lorraine Carter, left behind a trail. I just need to follow it. Reamer leaned back in his chair. Then that's where we start. That afternoon, Claire returned to the shelter to find Mason sitting in the courtyard, legs crossed on the bench, a sketchpad on his lap. He had drawn a small bird with wings outstretched, hovering above the jagged rooftops of a city skyline. That's beautiful, Claire said, taking a seat beside him. He didn't look up. It's a sparrow. What does it mean? I don't know, he said. It just showed up in my head. Claire gently placed a hand on the edge of the bench. Mason, I talked to a lawyer today. Someone who can help get your name back. Your real one. He stopped sketching. But only if you want that, she added. This won't be easy. It'll take time. And it'll mean more people knowing who you are. He finally looked at her. Will it change anything? It might change everything, she said. But it won't change you. He nodded slowly. Okay. They started that day. Claire, working with Reamer, traced the name Lorraine Carter to an old P.O. box in Newark, New Jersey. From there, they discovered her real name, Elaine Rowe, a woman with multiple aliases, most of them tied to low-level private placements and unlicensed foster arrangements. She had vanished from public records 10 years ago. But one of her aliases, L. Carter, had been listed as a guardian for a child named Nathan Gray. A child who had no birth certificate, no listed parents, and who had disappeared from a foster facility less than a year after being placed there. Claire's stomach turned when she read the report. Nathan Gray had matched Mason's age, appearance, and behavioral history. It was the missing link. With that name in hand, Reamer filed a motion to access sealed adoption documents tied to the alias. While the process was underway, Claire took Mason to a private clinic for the DNA test. The technician swabbed his cheek with quiet efficiency, and Mason remained silent the entire time. Afterward, they walked through the park in the soft light of the early evening. Mason kicked at the leaves with his shoes, silent until he finally asked, "What if the test says I'm not him?" Claire stopped. "Then you're still Mason. And I'll still be here." He nodded. They sat on a bench beneath a tall maple tree, the branches rustling above them. Mason pulled out a folded piece of paper from his pocket. "I've been writing stuff down," he said. "Things I remember." Claire glanced at the list. Some were fragments, words like train tracks, blue couch, woman with red lipstick. Others were names. A few were feelings. "Do you think any of it means something?" he asked. Claire smiled gently. "I think it all does. We just have to find out how." Back at the apartment that night, Claire found Richard sitting alone in the dark. He had not returned to his company office in days. The press hadn't caught wind of anything, yet. But Claire knew it was only a matter of time. "I spoke to a lawyer," she said, setting her bag down. "I assumed you would," Richard replied. "We're building the case. DNA test, court filings. And we found the woman, Lorraine Carter. Or whatever her real name is." He didn't react. "You should know this will go public eventually," she said. "When it does, everything you've built will be questioned." Richard looked up at her, and for once, there was no anger in his eyes. Only exhaustion. "I deserve it." Claire sat across from him. "Why didn't you stop it? At any point in the last 12 years, you could have said something." "I was afraid," he said. "Afraid of what it would do to my name, my legacy. Afraid of facing the child I failed. But mostly, I convinced myself he'd be better off without me." Claire stared at him. He wasn't. Richard closed his eyes. "I know." In the weeks that followed, the legal process moved forward. The DNA test came back, a 99.9% match. Mason was confirmed as Ethan Holloway. Reamer prepared the documentation to reverse the false death record and re-establish Mason's legal identity. The court hearing was set for early December. Claire didn't tell Mason the date right away. She waited until she was sure he was ready. One morning, she sat beside him on the shelter steps and said, "There's a court date now. A judge will decide if we can officially restore your identity. That means the world will know. Papers, reporters. Your face. Your name." Mason took a long breath. "What if I don't want that name?" Claire hesitated. "Then you don't have to take it. You can stay Mason. Or choose something new. But the important thing is that no one can take it from you again." He nodded. "Will I have to talk in court?" "Only if you want to." Mason looked out at the street, where two boys were playing with a soccer ball in the narrow alley. "I want to be heard," he said. "Just once." Claire squeezed his shoulder. "You will be." It was a Friday evening, just over 2 weeks before the scheduled court hearing, when everything fell apart. Claire arrived at the shelter later than usual, delayed by a strategy meeting with Reamer regarding media contingencies. She carried a folder of legal updates under her arm and 2 hot chocolates in a tray. It was something of a ritual by now. She'd bring something warm, Mason would pretend not to care, and then drink it anyway while they reviewed the day's progress. But the moment she stepped through the shelter doors, she knew something was wrong. The receptionist, a soft-spoken woman named Delia, looked up from her computer, her face visibly tight with concern. "He's not here," she said before Claire could speak. Claire blinked. "What do you mean, he's not here?" Delia stood slowly, coming around the counter. "I was just about to call you. He left this morning. Packed up everything." "What?" Claire dropped the tray onto a nearby chair. "What are you talking about? Mason would never." "He was calm," Delia interrupted. "Didn't seem panicked or in a rush. Said he had somewhere to be and that he'd be in touch soon." Claire's mind raced. Did anyone see him leave? Did he say where he was going? Delia hesitated. "One of the staff said they saw him talking to a man earlier in the morning. In a car. Black sedan, tinted windows. They didn't get a plate." Claire's heart dropped. She grabbed her phone and immediately called Reamer. "He's gone," she said the moment he answered. "Packed up, disappeared. There was a man in a car." Reamer didn't waste time with shock. "We'll alert the court liaison. I'll contact the police and file a protective notice under his legal status. You do what you do best, find him." Claire hung up and rushed out into the street, dialing Richard's number next. It rang twice before going to voicemail. "Richard, call me back. Now. Mason's missing." She called again. Still no answer. By the time she reached Richard's apartment in Midtown, she was breathless. She banged on the door with her fist, and when he didn't answer, she used the spare key he had given her months ago. Inside, the apartment was dark. No signs of life. She stormed through the rooms, calling his name, until she found a note on the kitchen counter. One line, scribbled in a sharp, hurried hand. "Don't look for him. He's safe." Claire stared at the words, her vision tunneling with disbelief. She left the building and got back into her car, her hands trembling against the steering wheel. She called Reamer again. "He took him," she said. "Richard took Mason." There was a pause. "Do you have proof?" "I have a note." "Claire, listen to me," Reamer said. "We need to treat this carefully. If you accuse Holloway without concrete evidence, he'll bury this under a mountain of legal firepower. We need something actionable. Something that can't be denied in court." Claire hung up and started driving. She went to the one place she thought Richard might go, the Holloway estate outside the city. She hadn't been back since finding the forged documents, but she remembered every detail of the estate's layout, including the guest cottage that stood behind the main house. When she arrived, it was past 10 o'clock at night. The gates were closed, but she entered the code again and drove up the gravel path. The manor was dark. Silent. But behind it, the small cottage's windows glowed with faint yellow light. Claire approached quietly, stepping through wet leaves and damp grass. The wind whistled through the trees, masking her steps. As she reached the side window, she peeked in. There he was. Mason. He sat on a chair near the fireplace, wearing a hoodie and sweatpants, his backpack tossed beside him. He was staring into the flames, not tied, not restrained, just there. Quiet. Still. Across from him, Richard sat with a drink in his hand, watching the boy with an expression that was impossible to read. Claire didn't wait. She knocked sharply on the door. Richard opened it moments later, clearly unsurprised. "Where is he?" she demanded. "He's fine. You took him without telling anyone. Without consent. That's abduction, Richard." "He came willingly," he said. "He needed to think. I gave him space." "You manipulated him," Claire snapped. "You used your power again." "He asked me questions," Richard said. "I answered them. Honestly. I told him everything. Claire pushed past him into the room. Mason looked up as she entered, his face unreadable. Are you okay? She asked, her voice softer now. He nodded. I wanted to talk to him. You could have told me. I didn't know how, he said. Claire turned to Richard. You had no right to take him. I wasn't keeping him, Richard replied. He was never mine to keep. She took a breath, steadying herself. You need to bring him back. Tonight. Mason stood. I'll go. Claire approached him slowly. Did he tell you the whole story? Mason nodded. Even the parts that made him look bad. And what do you think? I think he was scared. I think he still is. But I don't know if that means I should forgive him. Claire touched his shoulder. That's up to you. They left together, driving back to the shelter in silence. Mason didn't speak until they reached the entrance. I just wanted to know if he really regretted it, he said. And I think he does. Claire opened the car door for him. That still doesn't erase what he did. I know, Mason said, stepping out. But it's the first time someone told me the truth without asking me to accept it. Claire watched him walk back inside, his steps slow but sure. She sat in the car for several minutes before calling Reamer. He's back, she said. Safe. And Richard? He won't do it again. Good, Reamer replied. Because the hearing's been moved up. Claire's pulse quickened. To when? Next week. It was sooner than expected. But maybe, just maybe, they were ready. The courtroom was scheduled, the judge assigned, and the necessary documents filed. But even with every paper in place, Claire felt the air thickening around them. The silence before the hearing had weight, an invisible pressure building with each passing day, as if everyone involved was bracing for an aftershock none of them could name. Despite returning to the shelter, Mason had withdrawn again. He still met with Claire daily, still sketched in the afternoons and listened quietly to updates from Reamer, but he had stopped talking about how he felt. His words became clipped. His eyes wandered. When she pressed him, gently, he would say, I'm fine, and then fall silent. Claire recognized the signs. Something inside him was folding shut. The change had begun after their return from the estate. Something had shifted in that cabin, some unspoken agreement or realization that had left Mason raw. She suspected it was not just the weight of the truth, but the weight of what came next. Identity, once lost, rarely returned untouched. Determined to fill in the remaining gaps before the hearing, Claire resumed her search for the facility Mason, then Nathan Gray, had disappeared from after being placed by Lorraine Carter. Using the thread Reamer had uncovered about the alias and the bogus foster documentation, Claire tracked down an address tied to a now-defunct group home in upstate New York. It was a quiet place, nestled behind a long gravel drive in a town called Fenton's Hollow. The home had closed 7 years earlier following allegations of mismanagement, though no formal charges had ever been filed. All that remained now was a rusted mailbox and the skeletal shell of the building, boarded windows and ivy strangling the facade. Claire wasn't alone. She had brought a private investigator hired by Reamer, a woman named Linda Poole, known for being meticulous and persistent. They parked near the gate, climbed over the low fence, and walked up the overgrown path toward the building. Inside, the floorboards creaked and the air smelled of mildew and abandonment. Light filtered through cracks in the boards. In what once must have been the office, they found a metal filing cabinet, its drawers stuck from years of neglect. Linda pulled out a crowbar from her bag and pried the top drawer open. Most of the papers inside were damp or illegible, but one manila folder near the back was intact enough to read. It bore the name Nathan G. in thick black marker. Claire opened it carefully. Inside were intake notes, a medical form, and a behavioral report. Most notably, the intake form included a photo. A grainy black and white image of a boy no older than 6, with sunken cheeks and large eyes. Mason. The intake form noted the child had been delivered by a woman using the name L. Carter, claiming temporary guardianship due to a family emergency. No documentation had been submitted. The child had refused to answer questions about his prior name. One line stood out. Subject exhibits extreme anxiety when asked about his parents. Has mentioned someone named Ricky in a fearful context. Claire's heart clenched. She copied the pages, careful not to damage the originals. With this, they could prove that Mason had been delivered into an illegal system, further solidifying the argument that his entire history had been constructed on lies. Back in the car, Claire sat silently as Linda drove. He called Richard Ricky, she murmured. He must have been told not to speak his real name. Linda nodded. Or maybe he remembered it on his own, and didn't know what it meant. They returned to the city late that night. Claire brought the copies to Reamer, who studied them with a grim nod. This seals it, he said. We can argue coercion, erasure, intentional deception. The state will have no choice but to recognize the identity restoration. He paused. But that doesn't guarantee emotional closure. Claire knew he was right. The next day, Claire met with Mason in the courtyard of the shelter, the documents in a folder under her arm. I went to the place they took you, she said. He looked up, quiet. It was falling apart. But I found this. She handed him the photo. He stared at it for a long time, then slowly turned it over. I remember the wallpaper, he said finally. It had little clouds on it. I used to count them to fall asleep. Claire sat beside him. You were scared there. He didn't answer. But you weren't wrong, she added. Your memories were real. That place existed. And we have proof now. Mason took a deep breath, folding the photo carefully and placing it back into the folder. Will the judge believe me? He asked. She doesn't need to believe you, Claire said. She needs to believe the truth. And we've done that part. A long pause. I don't know if I want to be Ethan, he whispered. But I want to stop being no one. Claire's throat tightened. You're not no one, she said. You're Mason. You're Ethan. You're both. And whatever name you carry after the hearing, it's yours. No one can rewrite it again. He nodded. Then I want to be heard. You will be, she promised. A few nights later, Claire received an unexpected call. It was from Emma, Richard's former housekeeper. The woman's voice was quiet, a little hesitant. I found something, she said. Something from years ago. I think you need to see it. Claire visited her the next morning. Emma lived in a small apartment in Queens, walls lined with old photographs and knitted blankets. She welcomed Claire in and led her to a locked cabinet. I kept this, she said, retrieving a sealed envelope. Richard told me to destroy everything related to Ethan after the funeral. But I couldn't. I didn't believe he was gone. And I was right not to. Claire opened the envelope. Inside was a cassette tape. Emma looked at her. It's from a nanny who worked briefly in the Holloway estate. She recorded this to send to Richard after she was dismissed. Said she was worried about the boy. I don't think he ever listened to it. Claire had the audio transferred to digital format that evening. As she sat in her apartment with headphones on, the voice of a young woman came through. I'm not trying to accuse anyone, the voice said. But the boy, Ethan, he cries at night. He says things about being sent away if he's bad. He talks to the windows. I don't think he understands what's happening around him. And I don't think anyone's listening to him. Please, if you love him at all, don't ignore this. Claire sat still for a long time. The child they were trying to protect hadn't just been erased, he had been calling out, unheard, long before he disappeared. She forwarded the audio to Reamer. He called minutes later. We're going to use this, he said. Not just to prove his identity, but to prove the systemic failure. That will change the judge's approach. Claire looked out the window. Everything was ready. The case was built. The truth had surfaced. And now, finally, the world would have to listen. The morning of the court hearing began in silence. Claire stood in her apartment, staring out the window as the first streaks of dawn lit the skyline. She had barely slept. In the past week, everything had aligned: the DNA confirmation, the sealed files from the foster system, the affidavit from the private investigator, and the audio recording from the former nanny. The judge had accepted all documents into preliminary review, and today would decide whether the identity of Mason could legally be restored as Ethan Holloway. But the emotional gravity of the day had nothing to do with the court. It was what came after that weighed on her, what Mason would choose to carry with him, and what he would leave behind. The hearing was held in a family courtroom tucked into a quiet building in downtown Manhattan. Far from the chaos of criminal trials, this space was sterile and intimate. Pale wood benches. A raised platform for the judge. No jury. No cameras. Just a judge, 2 attorneys, and a handful of people whose lives were about to be unspooled in public. Claire arrived early, documents in hand. Reamer was already there, speaking with the clerk. Mason arrived shortly after, accompanied by a counselor from the shelter. He wore a black sweater and gray jeans, his hair neatly combed, his face tight with apprehension. When he saw Claire, he walked straight to her. "Did he come?" he asked quietly. She knew who he meant. "Yes," she said. Richard sat alone in the back row. He was dressed in a dark suit, face pale, expression unreadable. He had been subpoenaed to appear, not as a defendant, but as a material witness to a process he had once tried to bury. The judge entered at precisely 9 o'clock. She was a woman in her 60s with sharp features and no trace of theatricality. Her tone was firm but even. "This court recognizes the matter of identity restoration for the minor known as Mason Gray, also listed under the name Nathan Gray. Representation is present. We begin with the petitioner's statement." Reamer rose and began his argument. He spoke with calm authority, laying out the facts one by one: the DNA match, the erased hospital records, the verified documents from the now-closed foster home, the witness accounts, and the undeniable proof that Ethan Holloway had not died, but had been intentionally removed and hidden under an alias. Claire watched the judge's expression shift only once, when the audio clip was played. The courtroom filled with the ghostly voice of the nanny, warning of a child who cried to the windows and spoke of being sent away. When it ended, the room was still. Then Reamer nodded toward Mason. "Your Honor, with your permission, the minor would like to speak." The judge turned to Mason, her voice softening. "You may come forward if you're ready." Mason walked slowly to the front. Claire saw the tension in his hands, the way his fingers flexed and curled, the echo of the tic he'd always had. But his voice, when he spoke, was clear. "I don't remember everything," he began. "But I remember not knowing who I was. I remember being told to forget things. I remember being scared a lot. And then I remember being alone." He paused. "But I also remember a song. A voice. A name I was never supposed to say out loud. And then someone found me, and started to tell me the truth." He looked over at Claire, then back at the judge. "I don't know if I want to be Ethan Holloway again. But I want to stop being invisible." The judge nodded solemnly. "You may return to your seat." Mason did, moving quietly, shoulders squared. Then the judge turned to Richard. "Mr. Holloway, you are not under prosecution in this hearing, but you are expected to provide sworn testimony. Do you understand?" Richard stood. "I do." He was asked to recount his involvement. Claire listened as he explained, in the most controlled voice he could muster, how he had arranged for Ethan to be removed from the hospital. How he paid for silence. How he created the illusion of death. "I believed I was protecting my name," he said. "And I convinced myself I was protecting him, too. But it was selfish. And wrong. I don't ask for forgiveness. I'm only here because I need the truth to be written into the record." Reamer stood again. "Would you be willing to legally acknowledge Ethan Holloway as your son?" "Yes," Richard said without hesitation. I will sign whatever is necessary. Claire watched Mason's reaction. He didn't flinch. He didn't respond. But his jaw tightened. The judge took a long pause before speaking. This court recognizes the overwhelming evidence provided. The identity of the minor previously referred to as Mason Gray and Nathan Gray is hereby restored to his birth name, Ethan Richard Holloway. A beat of silence. Effective immediately, all legal documents, including state records, school filings, and medical history, are to reflect the restored identity. The court commends the petitioner for uncovering the truth and acting in the minor's best interest. The gavel struck. It was done. There was no applause. No celebration. Just a collective exhale. Outside the courthouse, Mason stood on the steps, staring down at the city street. Claire came up beside him, unsure whether to speak. "You can still call me Mason," he said. She smiled faintly. "I'll call you whatever you want." He glanced back at the building. "What happens now?" "We go forward," she said. "But this time, with the truth." They were about to walk toward the car when Richard stepped out, catching up to them. "Mason," he said, his voice low. "Can I speak with you? Alone?" Mason looked at Claire, who nodded and stepped away. Richard knelt slightly, meeting his son's eyes. "I meant what I said in there. I don't expect anything from you. But I need you to know. I never stopped thinking about you. I just didn't think I deserved you." Mason didn't respond right away. Then, after a moment, he said, "You don't." Richard's face twitched. "But I don't know if that means I hate you," Mason added. "I just know I need time." Richard nodded. "Take all the time you need." Mason turned away and walked back to Claire. She didn't ask what was said. She didn't need to. They got into the car and drove away, the courthouse shrinking behind them. Ahead lay something they hadn't had before. A beginning. The decision to restore Ethan Holloway's identity should have remained a quiet legal proceeding. That had been the plan: no press, no statements, no headlines. But in a city like New York, secrets wither quickly. And when the Holloway name appeared in the court's weekly log, it took only one curious legal intern with a blog and too much time to ask the right questions. Within 72 hours of the court ruling, Ethan's name was on every major news site in the country. Billionaire Richard Holloway linked to secret son presumed dead. Corporate mogul fabricated child's death to hide illegitimate heir. From street kid to heir, the Ethan Holloway scandal unfolds. The story ignited like dry brush under a match. Speculation filled the voids left by legal redactions. Anonymous sources, some real, others invented, claimed everything from tax fraud to a hidden estate in Europe. A former associate of Holloway's even suggested, during a televised interview, that Richard had used charity foundations as a front to bury his past. Suddenly, it was not just about a boy's forgotten name. It was about legacy, deception, and wealth, and the media devoured it. Claire read the first article at her kitchen table at 6 in the morning, the photo of Mason, taken years earlier, when he was still listed as Nathan Gray, staring up at her in grayscale. Her phone began buzzing before she finished the headline. Reamer called first. "This was inevitable," he said. "We controlled everything we could. But Holloway's name draws attention. It's no longer just a court case. It's a public crisis." Claire's second call was from the director of the shelter. "Reporters have been camped outside since sunrise," she said. "We can't keep Mason here anymore. It's not safe." That same hour, Claire and Mason packed their things and left the shelter through the back exit. She had arranged for them to stay in a friend's spare apartment across town, one with coded access and no exterior signage. It wasn't much, but it was quiet. As they drove through side streets, avoiding major intersections, Claire glanced at Mason in the passenger seat. "You doing okay?" He didn't answer right away. His eyes were focused on the passing city, watching it like it might vanish. "I don't want to be a story," he said finally. "You're not," she replied. "You're a person. The story is just noise. He turned to her, his voice sharper than usual. It doesn't feel like noise. They're saying I'm a scam. That I faked everything to get money. That I made you do it. Claire pulled over near a quiet park and stopped the engine. Look at me, she said. He did. We did not go through all this to convince strangers. We did it because it was the truth. Because your life matters. Let the world scream. We know who you are. Mason nodded, but the look in his eyes lingered. A mixture of doubt and anger, at the world, at Richard, and maybe even at himself. Later that day, a press release was issued from Holloway's corporate office. It was 3 paragraphs long, devoid of emotion. Mr. Holloway acknowledges the truth surrounding his paternity and the circumstances of the identity restoration of Ethan Holloway. He is cooperating fully with legal advisors to ensure compliance with all public and private obligations. At this time, Mr. Holloway asks for privacy for his son. It did little to quiet the chaos. Journalists continued to swarm every known location associated with the Holloway name. The board of Holloway Holdings called an emergency meeting. Investors demanded statements. News vans lined the street outside Richard's penthouse. Protesters even gathered outside his offices, holding signs that read, "Protect the children, not the legacy," and "Money buries truth." Claire received an invitation to appear on 2 major television shows. She declined both. But the requests kept coming. Eventually, the district attorney's office opened a formal inquiry into the Holloway estate's handling of financial disclosures during the period of Ethan's disappearance. While no charges were filed immediately, the possibility of civil suits loomed. Inside the borrowed apartment, Mason turned off his phone and avoided the internet. He no longer asked about the past. He asked about tomorrow. Will it always be like this? He asked one night. No, Claire replied. It fades. They move on to the next thing. He stared at the ceiling. But I won't. In response, Claire brought in a therapist, Dr. Evelyn Marcus, a woman with a calm voice and no judgments. At first, Mason refused to speak. Then he said a few words. Eventually, he started asking the questions he'd been hiding. Why did no one come looking for me? What if I don't want to be a Holloway? Can I keep the name Mason forever? Evelyn never rushed him. She just listened. And that, slowly, became enough. Meanwhile, Richard retreated from public life. He stepped down from several boards. His publicist issued one final statement. Mr. Holloway has taken personal leave to focus on rebuilding his relationship with his son. Claire doubted the sincerity. But then, one evening, Richard called her directly. I need to see him, he said. Why? To apologize. Properly. Without expectations. Claire hesitated. If he agrees, we'll meet. But it'll be on our terms. 3 days later, they met in a private room at Dr. Marcus's office. No press. No cameras. No lawyers. Richard arrived alone, older somehow. He carried nothing, wore no watch. Mason sat across from him, arms crossed, back straight. Richard spoke first. I've lost a lot, he said. But none of it hurts the way losing you did. And I don't mean when I let you go. I mean when I saw who you became without me. That's when I realized what I missed. Mason didn't respond. I won't ask you to come live with me. I won't ask for your forgiveness. But I want to be available. If you ever need me. That's all. Mason watched him closely. Then said, You don't get to be proud of me. Richard's mouth twitched. I know. And you don't get to pretend this was a mistake. It was a choice. Yes, Richard said. And the worst one I ever made. Mason looked down, his fingers fidgeting. Then, softly, he said, I don't know what I want from you. But maybe I'll figure it out. Richard nodded. I'll be here if you do. He stood and left. No fanfare. No final words. Just the quiet sound of a door closing behind him. Later that night, as the city lit up with its usual flicker of stories and secrets, Mason sat beside Claire on the apartment floor. "Maybe one day," he said, "I'll tell the story myself." Claire looked at him. "What would you call it?" He smiled faintly. "Not a ghost." She leaned back, exhaling. "That's exactly what you are," she said. "Real. Seen. And never forgotten again." In the weeks following the public storm, the chaos began to quiet, but nothing returned to how it had been. Silence, now, came with a different texture, no longer the numbing void of uncertainty, but the soft, deliberate hush of recovery. The borrowed apartment had become a refuge. Claire had moved in permanently with Mason, occupying the second bedroom and transforming it into a study where she continued her freelance legal work remotely. The space was sparse but warm, plants on the windowsill, mismatched furniture that somehow fit together, and always something simmering on the stove. It was not a mansion or a penthouse, but for the first time in years, Mason had a place where he knew he could return to, night after night, without fear that it would vanish by morning. He returned to school in January under the name Mason Ethan Holloway, a compromise Claire had suggested and he had accepted. He would keep the name he had claimed on the streets but include the name that had been taken from him. Not for the world. For himself. Adjusting to school was not simple. Though they had selected a small charter school with strict media policies and a tightly vetted community, some students still recognized the name. Whispers followed him in hallways. A few tried to provoke him, others just stared. But Mason had changed. He responded with silence, not shame. When he felt overwhelmed, he would retreat to the art room and draw in a corner by the window. Over time, some of the staring turned into curiosity, and curiosity into quiet respect. Claire, too, was rebuilding. She'd been offered a position as a legal advocate with a child welfare nonprofit, and after some hesitation, she accepted. Her days became filled with helping others navigate the very maze she and Mason had fought their way through. Her name now carried weight, not as a celebrity, but as someone who had proven she wouldn't look away. One afternoon in early March, as the wind began to shed its winter edge, Mason returned home with a folded piece of paper tucked inside his backpack. He handed it to Claire without a word. She unfolded it and found a sketch, a tree, bare and twisted, growing out of a jagged crack in the sidewalk. But at the top of one branch was a single blooming leaf. "It's for the school art show," he said. Claire smiled. "It's powerful." He shrugged. "They asked for something about change." "You think you've changed?" she asked. He didn't answer immediately. Then, softly, "I think I'm learning how." Though Richard had remained publicly absent, he stayed present in quiet ways. He had followed through on his promises, funded the shelter, anonymously sponsored scholarships, and transferred legal ownership of a trust meant for Mason, with no strings attached. Once a week, a letter arrived. Handwritten, brief. Never demanding a response. At first, Mason ignored them. Then, one morning in April, he sat at the table with a blank sheet of paper. He stared at it for a long time before beginning to write. When he finished, he sealed the envelope and handed it to Claire. "Can you send it?" he asked. She nodded. It was the first communication he had initiated. The content remained private. Spring deepened. Mason's therapy continued. Some sessions were quiet. Others were stormy. He sometimes left them silent, sometimes with red-rimmed eyes. But the heaviness he carried no longer felt like it was sinking him. He was learning to live alongside it. To name it. To breathe through it. One evening, while sorting through old boxes that had been sent from the shelter's archive, Claire found a drawing Mason had made years earlier, a crumpled sheet of a child's attempt at a self-portrait. The figure was barely formed, shadowed, almost erased in black pencil. She brought it to him, uncertain whether to share it. He looked at it, tilted his head, then smiled faintly. "I remember this," he said. "I thought that if I didn't draw myself clearly, maybe no one could find me." He took the paper from her hand and studied it. "Now I think I want to try again." He went to his desk, pulled out a fresh sheet, and began sketching. This time, the lines were clearer. Later that week, Claire received a call from a journalist she respected, a woman who had covered child protection cases for years, who had refused to sensationalize Mason's story during the initial media frenzy. "I'm doing a long-form piece on post-trauma identity," she said. "No quotes, no photographs without consent. I'd like to talk to you. And to Mason, if he's willing." Claire told her she'd ask. That night, she mentioned it to Mason. He considered it. "Would I get to tell it my way?" he asked. "Yes. Completely." He thought for a moment. "Then maybe. But not as a victim." "No," Claire said. "As a survivor." He nodded slowly. Another shift occurred in early May. Dr. Marcus, during a session, asked Mason whether he had thought about visiting his mother's grave. It was something no one had raised before. Mason went quiet for a long moment, then said, "I didn't know where it was." Claire reached out to Richard, who provided the information without resistance. The visit was quiet. Claire stood at a distance while Mason knelt in front of the headstone. He didn't speak aloud, didn't cry. He simply placed a small drawing, folded and sealed in a clear plastic sleeve, at the base of the stone and sat for several minutes, unmoving. On the way back, he said only one thing. "She used to sing to me." Claire said nothing. There was nothing more to say. By summer, the media had moved on. Mason remained a minor point of reference in articles about legal reform and child protection policy, but his name had faded from headlines. He wasn't a spectacle anymore. Just a boy, walking through his new life, with the past behind him and a path, however uncertain, ahead. The morning of his 13th birthday, Claire found him in the kitchen, making pancakes. "You're not supposed to cook your own birthday breakfast," she said. He grinned. "You burned them last year." She laughed. "Fair." He handed her a plate, then one for himself, and they sat together. After a few bites, he looked up and said, "Do you think people can start over, completely?" Claire tilted her head. "Not completely. But I think they can build something new with the pieces they have left." He nodded. "I think I'm ready for that." And he meant it. The day Ethan received his new legal documents was quiet by design. There were no courtrooms, no cameras, no flash of headlines. Just an envelope, hand-delivered by a courier to the apartment Claire and Mason now called home. Inside were 3 items: a revised birth certificate bearing the name Mason Ethan Holloway, a state-issued identification card with the same name, and a certified letter from the Department of Health and Records confirming the erasure of Nathan Gray from all legal systems. Claire found the envelope on the table that afternoon. She called Mason in from the balcony where he had been sketching the skyline. He took the envelope in both hands, turned it over once, then opened it without ceremony. His eyes scanned each page carefully, pausing on the line that read Parent of Record, Richard Holloway. "Does this make me official now?" he asked, half serious. Claire smiled gently. "It makes you recognized. You've always been real." He nodded and tucked the papers back into the envelope. "I want to keep this somewhere safe." Claire pointed to the small lockbox they kept for important things: photographs, letters, his sketchbooks. "Top shelf." He placed the envelope inside, closed the lid, and turned the key. Later that week, at Mason's request, they organized a small gathering, not a celebration in the traditional sense, but a quiet moment with the few people who had stood with him through the storm. It was held in the community room of the nonprofit where Claire now worked. Folded chairs, a table with food, and a simple printed sign that read "Welcome, Mason Ethan." Reamer came, offering a firm handshake and a rare smile. Emma, the former housekeeper, arrived with a wrapped package, a photograph from the Holloway estate, newly framed, showing a younger Richard holding Ethan in his arms. It was one of the only photos of the two of them together. Mason accepted it silently, nodding his thanks. Dr. Evelyn Marcus attended as well, keeping to the edge of the room but watching with quiet pride. Richard was not present. He had sent a letter, brief and handwritten, which Mason read privately before tucking it into his coat pocket. Claire didn't ask what it said. As people mingled, Mason stood near the window, looking out at the street below. Claire joined him. "You did it," she said. "I guess I did. Do you feel different?" He thought for a moment. "I feel lighter." She touched his shoulder gently. "You earned that." After most of the guests had left, Mason approached the front of the room and tapped his glass lightly, drawing the attention of the few who remained. "I don't like speeches," he began, eyes flicking down to the paper he held but never reading it. "But I want to say something." The room fell silent. "A year ago, I didn't know who I was. I thought names didn't matter because they always got taken from you anyway. But I've learned that a name is more than a label. It's something you choose to carry. And you get to decide how it defines you." He paused, glanced at Claire. "My name is Mason Ethan Holloway. Not because I belong to someone else. But because I survived being no one. And now I get to be someone. On my own terms." There was no applause. Just the quiet kind of respect that settled into a room like shared breath. That night, back home, Mason pulled out one of his sketchbooks. He had begun working on something new, a series of illustrations, each page capturing a moment from his life as he remembered it, not as others had told it. The alley behind the laundromat. The woman with the red jacket. The hospital bed. The face in the doorway. The swing set. The flame in the fireplace. Claire's smile at the shelter. The moment he saw his name returned. He flipped through the pages slowly, then tore one out, the drawing of the dark figure with blurred features, the self-portrait he'd made years ago when he thought staying invisible was the only way to stay safe. He folded it once, then twice, and placed it in the trash. Outside, the city moved on, unaware. But inside, something had settled. Not peace, exactly. Not yet. But something close to it. A few weeks later, Claire received a call from the director of an art program that supported children recovering from trauma. They had seen Mason's sketches, shared anonymously through one of Claire's colleagues, and wanted to offer him a spot in their summer mentorship program. When Claire told him, he didn't react immediately. Then he smiled and said, "I'll think about it." She knew that meant yes. Spring faded into early summer. The apartment grew brighter. The air softer. The sharpness of winter and its memories faded a little each day. Mason kept drawing. Claire kept working. Together, they began planning a short trip, nothing extravagant, just a visit upstate, to a cabin near a lake. Somewhere with quiet mornings and no expectations. As they packed their bags one evening, Mason stopped in the hallway, backpack slung over one shoulder. "You know," he said, "for a long time, I thought the world was something you had to survive." Claire looked at him. "And now?" "I think, maybe it's something you get to build." She didn't respond, just watched as he walked ahead. At the elevator, he turned and waited for her. She followed him in, and the door closed behind them, silent as a breath. The past had left its mark. It always would. But the name was his now. The life ahead was unwritten. And this time, it would be on his terms.